You're listening to episode number 4 of Overprescribed. Welcome to Overprescribed, the show that raises America's awareness on pharmaceutical medications in this country, all in an effort to help you, the everyday consumer, to live the safest, healthiest, and most informed medication experience possible. I'm your host, Mika Pollack, and let's get started. Hi, everybody. On today's show, we're talking about a report that was released by this nonprofit organization last year, actually in July of last year. And I know you're probably wondering, well, Mika, why are we even talking about an old report? But I wanted to bring it up for two key reasons. Number one, this report type will be released again in a matter of months because it's an annual report. And I want to prep our awareness going into the upcoming report. And two, because there's some stuff in this old report or the report from last year that I really want you to know just in case you weren't aware. But before we get into the core of the show, when's the last time you checked the FDA's Drug Safety Labeling Changes website page? Well, I took a look last week and noticed that there were 23 drugs with updates related to black box warnings in the last month alone. Well, it's actually 97 drugs when you factor in labeling changes, not just for black box warnings, but also including labeling updates for contraindications, warnings and precautions, adverse reactions, drug interactions, use in specific populations, patient counseling information, patient information, and even medication guide updates. All of this can be accessed from the www.accessdata.fda.gov/scripts/CDER/safety labeling changes page. And don't worry, if you didn't have a chance to write all of that down, I'll be sure to clearly include the link in our show notes from our website at www.overprescribedpodcast.com. So, do your best to make some plans to head on over to that FDA Drug Safety Labeling Changes page to check on the latest, just in case one of your medicines has been impacted. I'd hate for you to miss out on the latest information that could maybe help you or someone in your family. Okay, so there's this organization based out of Pennsylvania called the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. They're a nonprofit that's been serving the public and healthcare professionals for over 30 years, and they consider themselves to be independent watchdogs. They produce these reports that they call QuarterWatch reports, and these are published 4 times a year. According to them, from their website, it's a public service to provide an independent perspective on emerging drug risk. And they take these reports based on using the FDA's or the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's Adverse Event Reporting System, which also goes by an acronym called FAERS. They use it as the primary source for their reports. So on a previous episode, I talked to you a little bit about how there's a severe underreporting of side effects or adverse drug reactions occurring in America. And a lot of those adverse reactions or adverse drug reactions are going into the FDA's reporting system, and they're being reported. Side effects are being reported in this country by not only pharmaceutical companies, drug manufacturers who are receiving those reports from the public, but also the FDA. Their reporting system is receiving these adverse drug reaction reports directly from healthcare providers, as well as everyday patients and consumers like me and you, from their MedWatch system. Okay, so, and I'll get into more about how you can report on those again, even though I mentioned it in the previous episode. I will continuously tell you how you can report your side effects. So anyway, going back to the report, The annual report from the ISMP nonprofit called QuarterWatch has some really good information in it. And I want to take a quick moment to point out to you what was in the annual report issue. So this annual report issue from the ISMP is dated July 12th of 2017, and it includes new data from 2016 quarter four. So before you start saying, okay, Mika, we're even going back even further, I want you to know that in healthcare, it's not uncommon for data that's being collected to be reported in 1 year based on data from the prior year, because it does take time to collect the data, validate it, tabulate, assess, and then report back out on the data. So there's typically a lag. So anyway, this annual report from July 2017 is going to reference 2016 data. So this is all the adverse drug events that were reported into the US FDA's system in 2016. And the annual report that was released by ISMP and written by ISMP really provides some strong and worthwhile pieces of information that I think the public needs to know. Okay, so let's jump right into the report. So I'm looking on page 1 on the executive summary section, and right off the bat, I've highlighted several key things that I thought was really interesting in this annual report from ISMP in their QuarterWatch Annual Report. So I'm noticing here that for 2016 calendar year, it looks like the FDA only received a little over 1 million new reports of adverse events from the therapeutic use of prescriptions as well as over-the-counter drugs. So the specific number was, or the exact number was 1,165,073 new reports. That was very striking to me, because according to this annual report, in 2016, a total of 4.5 billion outpatient prescriptions were dispensed, which was a little bit under a 2% increase from 2015. And ISMP were able to pull that prescription, outpatient prescription information from a group called Quintiles IMS. So here it is. We have a little over 1 million reports came in when there was 4.5 billion prescriptions dispensed. And so just looking at that comparison, we're looking at less than 1% of the drugs that were being taken, theoretically, if all those prescriptions were filled, all of those medications taken in the U.S., less than 1% were reported to the FDA as having adverse events, when we know that just about every single drug on the market has some degree of side effects. So that was number one striking thing for me immediately from this annual report. The authors actually stated themselves on page 1 of the report. They say, quote, "The FAERS report totals greatly underestimate the extent of drug-related injuries actually occurring, with wide variation among drugs and events," end quote. And if you flip on over to page 2, I got to read this as well because this really captures the mind. So, quote, "The types of injuries reported affected every body system and include severe damage to the kidneys and liver, fatal cardiac events, cancer, potentially life-threatening allergic reactions, as well as neuropsychiatric effects such as depression, suicidal thoughts, and aggressive and violent acts. Although these largely voluntary reports capture only a fraction of the severe injuries that occur, the therapeutic use of drugs constitutes a major public health risk of the same order of magnitude as illicit use of drugs or violent crime." So, wow. Let's just let that sink in for a moment, okay? Because when I read that, for me, the first thing that popped in my mind is that, wait a minute, you mean to tell me that our regular everyday use of prescription medications and what can manifest out of taking medications, at least based on this reporting in 2000, or at least based on 2016 FDA adverse drug event reports, really tells us that we have a big problem with the reactions to drugs in this country that are as big as, of a public health threat as illicit use of drugs, illegal use of drugs, and violent crime. So that was really interesting. And I really appreciated the ISMP for putting that out there and being just so candid to really give us an understanding of the scale or the scope of the problem. And there were some other key findings as well. One was related to oral anticoagulant drugs, or commonly known as blood thinners, and the other was related to drugs that have withdrawal effects. So let's get into that a little bit too. So when it comes to oral anticoagulant drugs, the authors of this annual QuarterWatch report acknowledged not only the risk of oral anticoagulant drugs as high, but particularly noted the risk as unacceptably high. There were a little under 22,000 reports of severe injuries in the U.S., and this included a little over 3,000 reported deaths. And when looking at those 22,000 or so reports of severe injuries, it looks like the drug rivaroxaban, or Xarelto brand name, accounted for the highest numbers of those adverse drug event reports. It looks like there were at least, 4 other drugs that also were in this drug class of blood thinners that stood out in the reporting. And those drugs included, number 1, warfarin, also known by the brand name Coumadin. Number 2, apixaban, also known by the brand name Eliquis. Number 3, dabigatran, brand name Pradaxa. And then number 4, edoxaban, brand name Savasa. A notable section on the CDC study here in this report states, quote, "A separate CDC study released in late 2016 showed that anticoagulant drugs accounted for more emergency department ED visits for outpatient adverse effects than any other class of drugs in therapeutic use, including opioids, in parentheses, non-abuse visits, antibiotics, and diabetes drugs. The anticoagulant events were mostly severe, with 48.8% requiring a hospital stay. Further, using these data, QuarterWatch estimates 6.3% of patients exposed to an anticoagulant for 1 year will need to visit the ER, or the emergency room. Over the 10-year history of the CDC Adverse Event Study, emergency department visits for anticoagulant adverse drug effects increase more than 2-fold. The CDC data also illustrate that FAERS voluntary reporting substantially underestimates the drug-related injuries actually occurring. While not strictly comparable, the CDC's systematic study shows an estimated 228,600 ED annual visits for anticoagulants, or more than 10 times the FAERS total of voluntary reports, end quote. And again, FAERS stands for FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. Okay, also noted early on in last year's QuarterWatch Annual Report was notable information on drugs with withdrawal effects. So before I get into more on what the report notes about that, I just want to make a quick sidebar comment about drug withdrawal effects. Those don't only occur in people who are detoxing off alcohol or some illegal drug. Yes, drug withdrawal effects can also occur in people who take their medications as prescribed, and sometimes those people or their healthcare team may be able to identify that a withdrawal effect is happening, but sometimes the effects may go unnoticed or attributed to something else, and not due to the fact that someone is experiencing something adverse due to stopping a drug. But back to the report. Some of the withdrawal effects of note were nausea and dizziness, common side effects we've all heard of, but also things like electric shock-like sensations, insomnia, and anxiety. And these were the main symptoms for people who stopped taking a drug that would be classified as an opioid, a sedative, hypnotic, or antidepressant. So under the umbrella of psychoactive drugs. And here's something else I found very interesting. Quote, while issues involving opioid withdrawal are well known, the safety issue extends to drugs with even larger patient populations, most notably antidepressants and a large group of pain and anti-anxiety drugs. For many of these drug classes, the severity, duration, and likelihood of withdrawal effects is underestimated in prescribing information for physicians and medication guides for patients. In other cases, withdrawal effects were too poorly studied to support adequate estimates of injury rates, end quote. Okay, so we have a problem with another drug class outside of just opioids, particularly as it relates to withdrawal effects, and we have information or lack of information that is being pushed to physicians and even patients that can be very useful, especially at the point of care. The authors of this report were able to analyze 4,016 reports of drug withdrawal effects from the FDA 2016 adverse event data, with 42 drugs being identified as having, quote, clear signals for withdrawal effects, end quote. So no ambiguity, clear signals. One explanation as to why these withdrawal effects appears on page 2 of the report, and that reads, quote, basic neuroscience reveals that the chemical intrusion of psychoactive drugs into complex interacting signaling circuits changes how they function, end quote. And the impact on total populations across the U.S. is huge. According to the QuarterWatch Annual Report, it references a QuarterWatch scientific study that showed 1 in 6 adults were taking a psychiatric drug. And out of that number, 84.3% were taking the drug, quote, long-term, where withdrawal effects are more likely. Millions more take nerve pain or opioid medications on a long-term basis, end quote. And the last thing I want to point out about this section on drugs with withdrawal effects is about some of the specific drugs identified in the 2016 adverse drug report data, because there were, according to the report, quote, 4 neurotransmitters or receptors associated with withdrawal effects and reported drugs, end quote. Those were serotonin, gamma-aminobutyric acid, also known as GABA, dopamine, and the opioid class of drugs. Drugs called out by name included duloxetine, which goes by the brand name Cymbalta, which happened to have the largest number of reports, apparently a total of 888 total reports for all the drugs with withdrawal effects that were reported to the FDA in 2016. Other specific drugs called out were benzodiazepine tranquilizers like alprazolam, called by the brand name Xanax, clonazepam, brand name Klonopin, and lorazepam, brand name Ativan. Also fentanyl, and the highly used opioid acetaminophen hydrocodone, and even drugs like olanzapine, brand name Zyprexa, and methylphenidate, brand name Ritalin. And there's a more complete list of the drugs with signals for withdrawal symptoms midway in the report. I think it's around pages 13 and 14. Now, one of the things that the QuarterWatch authors also pointed out regarding drugs with withdrawal effects was that the issues are made more compounded for 2 key reasons. Quote, clinical testing for withdrawal effects ranges from limited to non-existent, and standard information for physicians and patients is inadequate for many drugs and, in some cases, frankly, misleading, end quote. The last key finding from this QuarterWatch Annual Report relates to the data itself. Okay, so if you think about any project where one of the tasks was to assess data, regardless of the industry that you're in, your assessment is going to be only as good as the data itself, right? Well, isn't it the technology that needs to be adequate enough to capture and report the data? Is the data accurate or complete enough? And you may even be thinking and wanting to assure that, can you rely on the system of data to make sound judgment calls on what to do based on the data and how to interpret the data. And I'm mentioning all that because based on what I'm reading here, it appears that while there is valuable information in the data that comes out of the FDA's adverse event reporting system, somehow, some way, it's not exactly where it needs to be. According to the QuarterWatch report, it's an aging monitoring system, and it suffers from, quote, FDA management neglect and failure to update its reporting requirements for the digital era, end quote. The reports of adverse event reactions coming into the system also seem to be inconsistently complete, where you have healthcare providers and patients reporting more complete reports on average versus reports coming from the drug manufacturers that were considered to be less complete. Which is very interesting to me because if I didn't know any of this, I would have honestly assumed it would be the other way around. And if you're curious about some of the examples of what may be missing that would render a report not as complete, the authors point out that key demographic points like age and even gender were missing from some of those drug manufacturer reports considered less complete. The differences in completeness of reports based on who's reporting to the FDA are significant to note because it looks like only 4.4% of the serious adverse event reports submitted straight to the FDA were from healthcare providers and patients, and the rest from drug manufacturers. So that means most of the reports that are in that 2016 data set are from the very group that seems to have the most trouble in submitting complete reports. Now, it's important to note that not all the reports from drug manufacturers were incomplete, which is definitely good news. It looks like 42.5% versus the 85% from reports from healthcare providers and patients were considered reasonably complete by the QuarterWatch team, with some manufacturers doing far better at submitting complete reports than others. Okay, so the QuarterWatch Annual Report is a long report, and honestly, I could easily do a much longer show on this report, but I won't. I think I want to save that for the upcoming annual report. But to wrap up this episode, I just want to mention 7 other quick takeaways that I've noticed in the report. Number 1, there were some notable short-term versus long-term trends on the reports of adverse events. For example, with regards to long-term trends, it looks like there's been a large increase in the number of reports coming in over the last decade, with about 273,000 reports coming in 2007 to the FDA versus the previously mentioned 1 million plus that was received in 2016. And the authors point out that the increase reflects the increase of use of drugs with, quote, substantial toxicity, end quote. Number 2, the harms caused by oral anticoagulants have, quote, earned rank as the highest priority drug safety problem in 2016, end quote. Which I have to point out, again, since most of us probably remember 2017 as the year where most of the mainstream media attention was on the opioid crisis. Number 3, the anticoagulant or blood thinner, warfarin, has been a standard of care since 1954. But it's mentioned as hazardous. It also noted as a close chemical cousin to rat poison. Number 4, on page 12 of the report, the QuarterWatch Annual Report authors point out what they call 5 positive steps to improve the safety of high-risk anticoagulant drug class, which is good to see any report that points out issues, but also possible remedies to fix a problem. Okay, I also want to point out some specific parts in the report for you too, just in case you want to go back and read those sections. So my number 5 thing I wanted to quickly mention as a takeaway was on page 14. There it talks about, in a section called Defining Drug Withdrawal, it's pointed out that the best test of whether a symptom is related to withdrawal is that it lessens or disappears shortly after the drug is restarted. Number 6, point to mention, on page 16, it says, quote, both the FDA approved warnings for physicians and information for patients give no hint of extent of withdrawal symptoms that a majority of patients taking antidepressants will experience, end quote. And I thought that was definitely very notable to mention. And then finally, number 7, this is on page 17, under a section labeled Conclusions. It states, and it's a long statement, let me quote this, quote, while the withdrawal effects of opioids and benzodiazepines are a major policy focus today, and the drug information includes clear warnings, the information about antidepressant withdrawal is currently inadequate. In addition, withdrawal effects for psychoactive drugs are not systematically studied at the time of approval, and the disclosure of the withdrawal studies that are conducted is limited. Finally, telling patients not to stop a medication without consulting a healthcare professional is not adequate warning about likely effects of stopping these drugs. End quote. So, if you're interested in reading the full 25-page QuarterWatch Annual Report from last year, I'm going to include a link to that in the show notes. To access that, you can just simply go to our website, www.overprescribedpodcast.com, and click on the episode number for posting that's currently right on our homepage. I'll also make sure you can access the 2 reports that they released since the annual reports. One was released in November 2017 and is titled Safety Signals for 2 Novel Drugs, and the other was just released earlier this year and is titled Safety Profiles of Newer Contraceptives. I'd like to thank the good folks over there at the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, or the ISMP, for producing these QuarterWatch reports. I hope these continue for many more years to come, and I hope to share more relevant information with you as it comes out from this organization and many others. To learn more about that nonprofit, I'll include a link to their organization in the show notes too. And please, if you've enjoyed the show, leave us a review. We definitely want to hear from you. And don't hesitate to contact us directly as well through email. That email again is talk@overprescribedpodcast.com. And you can always hit us up on Twitter @_overprescribed.